Commander Jake Morrison stood in the observation deck of the USS Meridian, watching the massive space station grow larger through the reinforced windows. The structure was unlike anything humanity had ever built, with flowing curves that seemed to bend light itself, and towers that spiraled into impossible geometries. This was Harmony Station, the neutral meeting ground where species from across the galaxy came to discuss peace and trade. Jake adjusted his dress uniform one final time. The blue fabric felt strange after years of combat fatigues, but today required ceremony. Today, humanity would formally request membership in the Galactic Council, the ancient alliance that had kept peace among the stars for over 10,000 years. Ambassador Lisa Carter approached from behind, her heels clicking against the metal deck. She was a career diplomat, elegant and composed, with gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had spent months preparing for this moment, studying alien cultures and customs through the limited information humanity had gathered. "Nervous, Commander?" she asked, standing beside him at the window. Jake shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just taking it all in. Hard to believe we're really here." The journey to this moment had taken 3 years. First contact had come through radio. Signals, then careful exchanges of mathematical concepts and basic language. The aliens had been cautious, but curious about the newcomers from what they called the Outer Rim. Humanity had proven their technological capability by building faster-than-light engines based on alien theoretical frameworks shared during the early exchanges. Now came the real test. The Galactic Council required all potential member species to undergo a formal evaluation. They needed to prove they were committed to peace and would contribute positively to galactic civilization. For humanity, this was their chance to join something greater than themselves. The docking process took nearly an hour. Harmony Station was so vast that their entire ship seemed like a small boat approaching a floating city. Alien vessels of every conceivable design surrounded them, some sleek and metallic, others that appeared to be grown rather than built, and a few that defied any earthly comparison. The diplomatic party was small but carefully chosen. Ambassador Carter led the group, with Jake as military advisor, Dr. Helen Murphy as the science representative, and 2 junior diplomats who would handle translation and documentation. They had practiced this moment countless times, but nothing could truly prepare them for walking among beings from other worlds. The station's interior was breathtaking. Vast chambers stretched overhead, filled with beings that looked like living crystals, others that seemed to be made of pure light, and creatures with multiple limbs and exotic features. The air carried unfamiliar scents, and the sound of dozens of languages being translated in real time by universal communication devices. Their escort was a tall, graceful being with pale blue skin and large, dark eyes. She introduced herself as Guide Serena, though Jake suspected that was a simplified version of her real name. She led them through corridors lined with what appeared to be living walls that pulsed gently with soft light. "The Council is eager to meet your species," Serena explained as they walked. "We have studied your transmissions and find your culture fascinating. Your mathematics and sciences show great promise." They entered a magnificent chamber with a domed ceiling that displayed what looked like a real-time view of space. Representatives from dozens of species sat in curved rows around a central speaking area. Jake recognized some of the species from the briefing materials, though seeing them in person was still startling. The Zephyrians looked like living gemstones, their crystalline bodies refracting light in beautiful patterns. They communicated through harmonic tones that their translators converted to speech. The Luminari appeared to be beings of pure energy contained in roughly humanoid shapes, glowing softly with internal light that shifted colors with their emotions. The Kethval were the most alien-looking, with multiple arms, compound eyes, and chitinous shells, though their movements were graceful and their translated voices were surprisingly gentle. Ambassador Carter stepped forward when invited. "Honored representatives of the Galactic Council," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. "I am Lisa Carter, speaking for the United Earth Government. We come before you in the spirit of peace and cooperation, hoping to join your alliance and contribute to the harmony you have built among the stars." The response was warm but formal. Representatives from several species welcomed humanity and expressed curiosity about their world and culture. Dr. Murphy presented their scientific achievements and peaceful intentions, while Jake remained silent, observing the proceedings with the trained eye of a military officer. Then came the moment that would change everything. The Zephyrian ambassador, whose crystalline form sparkled as he spoke, rose from his position. His harmonic voice translated as formal but kind. "Before any species may join our alliance, they must demonstrate their commitment to peace. This has been our way for millennia, and it has kept our galaxy free from the horrors of war." He gestured to his fellow representatives. "Each species that joins us undergoes the same evaluation. We ask each delegation member to share their personal contribution to peace. Specifically, we must know your individual kill count." The chamber fell silent. Jake felt his stomach tighten as he realized what was being asked. The Zephyrian continued, apparently unaware of the human's sudden tension. "This is a moment of honesty that bonds all peaceful species. When beings admit they have never taken life, when they can proudly say their kill count is 0, they join our family of true civilization." Other alien representatives nodded in agreement. A luminary delegate spoke up, her glow shifting to warm gold tones. "I have lived for 400 of your years and have never caused harm to another conscious being. My kill count is 0. A Kethval representative clicked his mandibles together in what Jake had learned was their equivalent of a smile. "My people evolved as herbivores. Though I serve in our defense forces, I have only ever helped rescue beings in distress. My kill count is 0. One by one, other representatives shared their 0 kill counts. Some mentioned their species had evolved beyond violence thousands of years ago. Others explained that their military forces existed only for disaster relief and exploration. The concept of actually killing another intelligent being seemed foreign to them, almost incomprehensible. Ambassador Carter looked at Jake, her face pale. They had prepared for many scenarios, but not this. None of their briefing materials had mentioned this particular requirement. The Zephyrian ambassador's attention turned to the human delegation. "Now, honored guests from Earth, please share your kill counts so we may welcome you properly into our peaceful alliance." Dr. Murphy spoke first, her voice slightly shaky. "I am a scientist and healer. I have dedicated my life to preserving life, not taking it. My kill count is 0. The aliens nodded approvingly, their various forms of expression showing satisfaction. Ambassador Carter cleared her throat. "I am a career diplomat. I have spent my life building bridges between peoples and resolving conflicts through words rather than violence. My kill count is 0. Again, approving sounds from the gathered representatives. Then all eyes turned to Commander Jake Morrison. He stood slowly, his military bearing evident in every movement. The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the station's life support systems seemed loud. Jake looked around the room at dozens of alien faces, all expecting to hear another 0. Jake took a deep breath and spoke into the silence that would soon be shattered forever. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the great chamber, surrounded by dozens of alien beings who had all just proclaimed their 0 kill counts with obvious pride. Their expectant faces turned toward him, waiting for another 0 to add to their collection of peaceful statistics. The silence stretched on as Jake looked down at his hands, hands that had held weapons, hands that had made decisions, hands that carried more weight than these beings could possibly imagine. He raised his head and met the crystalline gaze of the Zephyrian ambassador. "My name is Commander Jake Morrison, United States Army retired. I served my planet's military forces for 30 years. He paused, watching as the aliens leaned forward with interest. My kill count is not 0. A ripple of confusion passed through the chamber. The luminary representative's glow flickered from warm gold to a cooler blue, which Jake had learned indicated uncertainty or distress. The HFY delegates' compound eyes focused more intently on the human, while several other species began making sounds that their translators struggled to convert into recognizable words. The Zephyrian ambassador's harmonic tones took on a different quality. Perhaps there is a translation error. You said your kill count is not 0. Could you clarify what you mean? Jake nodded slowly. I mean that during my military service, I was required to take lives to protect others and complete my missions. I will give you my count, but I need to explain the context so you understand. Ambassador Carter shifted nervously beside him. They had not prepared for this revelation, but there was no way around it now. The truth would have to be told. I enlisted in the Army when I was 18 years old, Jake began. My first deployment was to a place called Afghanistan. My country was at war with groups that had attacked civilian targets and killed thousands of innocent people. The aliens listened intently, though their expressions showed growing confusion at concepts like war and civilian attacks. During my first tour of duty, I served as an infantry soldier. Our job was to locate and neutralize enemy combatants who were threatening local populations and our own forces. Jake's voice remained steady and professional. In my first firefight, I killed 3 enemy soldiers who were shooting at my squad. That brought my count to 3. The chamber erupted in sounds of distress. The luminary representative's glow dimmed significantly, while the Zephyrian ambassador's crystalline form began resonating with what could only be described as shock. Several of the smaller species began making rapid chittering sounds that the translators couldn't keep up with. Please, let me continue, Jake said, raising his hand. You asked for my kill count, and I will give it to you honestly. The Zephyrian ambassador managed to compose himself enough to speak. You have ended the lives of 3 conscious beings. More than 3, Jake replied. That was just my first engagement. I served 2 full tours in Afghanistan, each lasting 15 months. During that time, I participated in over 40 combat operations. Jake began to recount his service methodically, the way he might deliver a military briefing. He explained how warfare worked on Earth, how soldiers were trained to engage enemy forces that threatened civilians or their fellow soldiers. The aliens struggled to understand concepts that seemed basic to human military thinking. In one operation, we were defending a village that housed refugees from the fighting, Jake continued. Enemy forces attacked during the night with the intention of harming non-combatants. My squad held the perimeter for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived. I personally eliminated 11 attackers during that engagement. The numbers climbed as Jake continued his account. He described urban warfare, where enemy combatants hid among civilian populations and had to be eliminated with precision to avoid innocent casualties. He explained sniper operations, where he provided overwatch for his fellow soldiers and eliminated threats from long distance. During my second deployment to Afghanistan, I served as a squad leader, Jake said. This meant I was responsible not only for my own actions, but for directing the actions of 12 other soldiers. When we engaged enemy forces, I coordinated our response and made tactical decisions that resulted in enemy casualties. The alien delegates were no longer just confused. Many appeared to be experiencing something approaching horror. The HFY representative, despite belonging to a species that looked more intimidating than the others, had actually backed away from the central speaking area. Jake pressed on. After Afghanistan, I was deployed to Iraq. The situation there was different but no less dangerous. Our mission was to help stabilize the region and protect the local population from insurgent forces that used terrorism and violence to control territory. He described convoy operations where his unit was attacked by roadside bombs and had to respond with overwhelming force. He explained how insurgents would use civilians as shields, forcing American soldiers to make split-second decisions about who lived and who died. In Iraq, my count increased significantly, Jake said matter-of-factly. Urban combat is more intense than mountain warfare. Enemy forces can attack from any building, any rooftop, any alley. A single engagement might involve dozens of hostiles. The luminary delegate's glow had almost completely faded. The Zephyrian ambassador's crystalline structure was vibrating at a frequency that made the air itself hum with tension. Other species were making sounds of distress that needed no translation. By the end of my second Iraq deployment, my personal kill count had reached 147, Jake announced. Each one was a deliberate action taken to protect either civilian lives or the lives of my fellow soldiers. The chamber fell into stunned silence. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. 147 lives taken by a single individual was beyond the comprehension of beings who had evolved past violence millennia ago. The Zephyrian ambassador struggled to form words. 147 conscious beings? You have personally ended the lives of 147 thinking, feeling creatures? Yes, Jake replied simply. And I'm not finished with my count yet. If the chamber had been quiet before, it now fell into absolute silence. Several alien representatives appeared to be having difficulty maintaining their composure. The concept that there could be more seemed to break something in their understanding of how rational beings should behave. Ambassador Carter stepped forward, trying to provide context. Commander Morrison served with distinction and honor. Every action he took was in defense of innocent life and in accordance with the laws of war as recognized by Earth's international community. But the aliens were too shocked to process her explanation. They stared at Jake with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching fear. Here stood a being who had personally ended nearly 150 lives and spoke of it with calm professionalism. Jake looked around the chamber at the faces of beings who had never conceived of such numbers. You wanted honesty about my kill count. I'm giving you complete honesty. But before I continue, you need to understand that everything I did was in service of protecting those who could not protect themselves. The Kethval representative, who had managed to regain some composure, spoke in a voice that trembled despite the translator's neutral tones. There is more? Your count is higher than 147? Jake nodded grimly. Much higher. I served for 30 years and rose through the ranks to positions of greater responsibility. The numbers I've given you so far only cover my time as an enlisted soldier and junior officer. I haven't told you about my time in special operations or my years as a senior commander. He paused, letting that information settle over the chamber like a dark cloud. The count I've given you represents only the first 5 years of my military career. The silence in the great chamber stretched on as the alien representatives struggled to process what they had just heard. Jake Morrison had killed 147 beings in his first 5 years of service, and he was telling them this was only the beginning. The luminary delegate's glow had faded to barely visible wisps of light, while the Zephyrian ambassador's crystalline form continued to vibrate with what could only be described as psychological distress. Jake continued his account with the same calm professionalism he had maintained throughout. After my second deployment in Iraq, I was selected for special operations training. This meant working with smaller units on more dangerous missions that required greater precision and often higher casualty counts among enemy forces. The Kethval representative made a sound that the translator rendered as something between a gasp and a clicking noise. Higher casualty counts? The numbers grow larger? Yes, Jake replied. Special operations missions were different from conventional infantry work. We were sent after high-value targets, enemy leaders, and weapons facilities. These missions required eliminating not just immediate threats, but entire enemy command structures. Jake described his first special operations mission, a nighttime raid on a compound where enemy leaders were planning attacks on civilian targets. His team of 8 soldiers infiltrated the facility and eliminated all hostile personnel to prevent future attacks on innocent people. That single mission added 23 to my count, Jake said matter-of-factly. Each enemy combatant eliminated was someone who would have otherwise directed attacks against civilian populations. The alien delegates were no longer just shocked. Several appeared to be experiencing what humans might recognize as panic attacks. The concept of deliberately seeking out and killing specific individuals was so foreign to their understanding that their minds struggled to process it. Jake pressed on, describing his progression through the special operations community. He explained how missions became more complex and how his role evolved from trigger puller to mission planner. The aliens listened in growing horror as he described operations that involved multiple teams working together to eliminate entire enemy networks. During my time in special operations, I participated in over 200 missions across 6 different countries, Jake continued. Some missions were surgical strikes against individual targets. Others involved clearing multiple facilities in coordinated attacks. By the end of that assignment, my personal kill count had reached 438. The Zephyrian ambassador's form shuddered so violently that small crystal fragments began falling to the chamber floor. The sound they made was like broken bells chiming in discord. 438? You have personally killed over 400 conscious beings? Yes, Jake answered, but that's still not the complete count. Ambassador Carter watched nervously as several alien representatives began making distressed sounds. She had never seen beings react with such psychological trauma to simple military statistics. On Earth, Jake's service record would be considered exemplary. Here, it was apparently incomprehensible. Jake explained his next career phase, his promotion to company commander. When you command a unit of soldiers, you become responsible not just for your own actions, but for the actions of everyone under your command. If my soldiers killed enemy combatants, those deaths were ultimately my responsibility as their leader. The aliens struggled with this concept. The idea that one being could be held accountable for the actions of others was difficult for species that had evolved past hierarchical military structures. The luminary delegate's glow flickered weakly as she tried to speak. "You claim responsibility for deaths caused by other beings?" she asked, her translated voice barely audible. "Yes," Jake replied. "Command responsibility is a fundamental principle of human military leadership. When I ordered my soldiers into combat, when I made tactical decisions that resulted in enemy casualties, those deaths became part of my count." Jake described his first major command, leading a company of 120 soldiers during a deployment to Syria. His unit was tasked with eliminating an enemy organization that had taken control of several cities and was brutalizing the civilian population. Over the course of that deployment, my company eliminated over 800 enemy combatants, Jake said. As their commander, I was responsible for every tactical decision, every engagement, every casualty. That brought my total count to over 1,200. The Kethval representative actually fell backward, his chitinous form clattering against the chamber floor. Other delegates rushed to help him while making sounds of distress that needed no translation. The concept of a single individual being responsible for over 1,000 deaths had broken their ability to comprehend rational behavior. Jake continued his account, describing his rise to battalion commander, then regimental commander. With each promotion, his responsibilities grew larger and his casualty counts climbed higher. He explained how senior officers made strategic decisions that affected entire operations involving thousands of soldiers. As a regimental commander, I was responsible for the actions of over 3,000 soldiers across multiple combat zones, Jake said. During my 2-year assignment at that level, operations under my command resulted in approximately 4,000 enemy casualties. The chamber erupted in sounds of distress. Several alien species began making what could only be described as keening wails. The Luminari delegates' glow extinguished completely, leaving only a vague humanoid outline. The Zephyrian ambassadors' crystalline structure was resonating at such a high frequency that other delegates were covering their auditory organs. 4,000, the Zephyrian managed to ask through his distress. You are responsible for the deaths of 4,000 conscious beings? Over 5,000 by that point in my career, Jake corrected. But I still haven't reached the highest levels of command. Ambassador Carter stepped forward, trying desperately to provide context. Please understand, Commander Morrison served with the highest honor. Every action was taken in accordance with international law and rules of engagement, designed to minimize civilian casualties and protect innocent life. But the aliens were beyond understanding context. They stared at Jake as if he were some kind of monster, a being whose very existence challenged their understanding of how intelligent life should evolve. The idea that someone could be responsible for thousands of deaths and still function as a rational, thinking individual was incomprehensible to them. Jake described his promotion to division commander, responsible for over 15,000 soldiers across multiple theaters of operation. He explained how decisions at that level affected entire campaigns and how casualty counts grew exponentially with the scope of operations. During my time as a division commander, I oversaw operations that resulted in approximately 12,000 enemy casualties, Jake said. This included major offensive operations designed to liberate civilian populations from enemy control and prevent larger massacres. The silence that followed was deafening. Alien representatives sat frozen in shock, unable to process numbers that continued to climb beyond their worst nightmares. The concept of a single individual bearing responsibility for 17,000 deaths had shattered their understanding of civilized behavior. Jake looked around the chamber at faces that showed fear, horror, and complete incomprehension. You asked for my kill count, he said quietly. I'm giving you complete honesty, but I want you to understand that every death I'm responsible for haunts me. I carry the weight of every decision, every life lost, every family destroyed. He paused, letting his words sink in. And I'm still not finished counting. The Zephyrian ambassador's crystalline form began to crack, actual fissures appearing in his structure as his mind struggled to cope with the psychological trauma of these revelations. The chamber filled with sounds of distress from dozens of species who had never imagined such numbers were possible. Jake Morrison stood alone in the center of it all, carrying a burden that was breaking the minds of beings from across the galaxy. The great chamber had descended into chaos as alien representatives struggled to process the numbers Jake Morrison had revealed. 17,000 deaths attributed to a single individual was beyond their comprehension, yet Jake stood calmly. In the center of the room, his military bearing unchanged, despite the psychological breakdown occurring around him. The Zephyrian ambassador's crystalline form continued to crack, while the Luminari delegate had become little more than a faint outline. Medical personnel from various species rushed to aid delegates who were experiencing what could only be described as mental collapse. Yet Jake was not finished with his account. My final promotion was to Corps Commander, Jake said, his voice cutting through the sounds of distress. A corps consists of multiple divisions, typically between 40 and 60,000 soldiers. At this level, strategic decisions affect entire regions and can determine the outcome of major conflicts. Ambassador Carter watched helplessly as more alien delegates began showing signs of severe psychological trauma. She had never imagined that a simple recounting of Jake's military service would have such devastating effects on beings from peaceful civilizations. Jake described his assignment as commander of the Third Corps during what Earth historians called the Pacific Crisis. An aggressive nation had launched simultaneous attacks on multiple allied countries, threatening to plunge an entire region into chaos and civilian suffering on a massive scale. The enemy had occupied 6 different countries and was systematically eliminating civilian populations they considered undesirable, Jake explained. Our mission was to liberate these territories and stop the genocide that was taking place. The aliens who were still capable of listening struggled with concepts like genocide and systematic elimination of populations. These were ideas so alien to their peaceful nature that their minds could barely process them. The campaign lasted 18 months and involved coordinated operations across multiple theaters, Jake continued. My corps was responsible for liberating 3 of the occupied countries. This required defeating enemy forces that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Jake's voice remained steady as he described the largest military operation he had ever commanded. Over 200,000 soldiers under his overall command engaged enemy forces in a series of battles that determined the fate of millions of civilian lives. During the Pacific Crisis, operations under my command resulted in approximately 38,000 enemy casualties, Jake said. Combined with my previous service, this brought my total count to over 55,000 deaths, for which I bear direct or indirect responsibility. The few alien delegates who had managed to remain conscious stared at Jake in absolute horror. 55,000 deaths was a number so large it defied their understanding of how intelligent beings should behave. Their peaceful civilizations had never produced individuals capable of such massive destruction. But then Jake did something that surprised them all. For the first time since beginning his account, his professional composure cracked slightly. His voice took on a different quality, one tinged with pain and exhaustion. Every single one of those 55,000 deaths is burned into my memory, he said quietly. I can tell you the date and circumstances of every major engagement, every tactical decision that led to casualties, every report that crossed my desk with enemy body counts. Jake began to describe what humans called the warrior's burden. He explained how military leaders carried the psychological weight of their decisions long after the fighting ended. The aliens listened with growing confusion as he described sleepless nights, recurring nightmares, and the constant presence of faces he would never forget. You look at me and see a monster, Jake said, his eyes moving around the chamber. Someone who has caused unimaginable death and destruction. But what you don't understand is that every death I'm responsible for was meant to prevent even greater loss of life. He described the Pacific Crisis in more detail, explaining how enemy forces had been systematically murdering civilian populations. The choice had not been between war and peace, but between allowing genocide to continue or using overwhelming force to stop it. The enemy had already killed over 2 million civilians before we intervened, Jake explained. Intelligence estimates suggested they would kill another 8 million if allowed to continue their operations. Every enemy soldier we eliminated was someone who could no longer participate in mass murder. The mathematical reality began to sink in for some of the alien delegates. Jake's 55,000 kills had prevented the deaths of 8 million innocent people. The ratio was staggering, but it represented a fundamental concept that peaceful species had never had to consider. Jake continued describing the burden of command, explaining how senior military officers had to make decisions knowing that people would die regardless of what they chose. The only question was who would die and how many. I never ordered an attack without knowing exactly what it would cost, Jake said. Every operation required detailed casualty estimates for both our forces and enemy forces. I approved actions, knowing that hundreds or thousands would die as a direct result of my decisions. He described the weight of reading casualty reports, of writing letters to families who had lost loved ones, of carrying responsibility for every soldier who died following his orders. The aliens struggled to understand how any mind could function under such psychological pressure. The hardest part wasn't the enemy casualties, Jake admitted. It was the knowledge that my tactical decisions would result in the deaths of my own soldiers. Over 30 years of command, I lost 8,467 soldiers under my command to enemy action. This revelation struck the aliens differently than the enemy casualty counts. The concept that Jake carried responsibility not just for killing enemies, but for the deaths of those he was supposed to protect, added another layer of incomprehensible burden. Jake explained how human military leaders trained specifically to make impossible decisions. They learned to function despite carrying psychological weights that would crush most people. They sacrificed their own peace of mind so that others could sleep safely. You asked for my kill count, and I've given it. To you, honestly, Jake said. 55,000 enemy deaths that I'm directly or indirectly responsible for. But I want you to understand the context behind every single one of those numbers. He described specific battles, explaining how tactical decisions were made under pressure with incomplete information. He told them about operations where splitting seconds determined whether civilians lived or died, where the choice was between accepting heavy casualties or allowing enemy forces to escape and kill innocents. Elsewhere, every death weighs on me, Jake said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. I see their faces in my dreams. I remember every report, every casualty count, every family destroyed by my decisions. This is what it means to be a human military commander. The chamber had fallen completely silent, except for the sounds of alien delegates struggling with psychological trauma. They were beginning to realize that this human was not a monster who killed without conscience, but someone who had accepted an unimaginable burden to protect others. Jake looked around at their faces, seeing fear and horror, but also the beginning of something else. Understanding, perhaps, or at least recognition that his actions had been driven by necessity rather than bloodlust. You live in a peaceful galaxy because your species evolved beyond violence, he said quietly. But humans learned a different lesson. We discovered that sometimes the only way to protect peace is to be better at war than those who would destroy it. The Zephyrian ambassador managed to speak despite his cracked form. 55,000 deaths. You carry responsibility for 55,000 conscious beings? Jake nodded slowly. That's my personal count after 30 years of military service. Every death necessary to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. He paused, looking directly at the crystalline being. But there's something else you need to understand about my numbers. The chamber remained in stunned silence as Jake Morrison's words hung in the air like a dark promise. 55,000 deaths was already beyond the comprehension of beings who had evolved past violence, yet Jake's final statement suggested there was more to learn. Ambassador Carter watched nervously as alien delegates struggled with psychological trauma that was clearly visible in their various forms of distress. The Zephyrian ambassador's cracked crystalline form managed to vibrate. Out of question. What else could there possibly be? You have already told us numbers that shatter our understanding of rational behavior. Jake looked around the chamber at faces filled with horror and confusion. What I need you to understand is that among human military leaders, my kill count of 55,000 is actually considered quite low. The words fell into the chamber like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled delegates. Several aliens who had managed to maintain their composure throughout Jake's previous revelations now began showing signs of complete mental breakdown. Ambassador Carter stepped forward, knowing that what came next would either destroy any chance of human membership in the Galactic Council or force these peaceful beings to confront truths about the universe they had never imagined. Commander Morrison served with distinction and followed strict rules of engagement designed to minimize casualties, she said clearly. His numbers reflect someone who was very careful about the use of force and who always sought to achieve objectives with the least possible loss of life. The luminary delegate, who had been reduced to barely visible wisps of light, somehow managed to speak. You are saying there are humans with higher kill counts than 55,000? Much higher, Carter confirmed. Throughout human history, military and political leaders have been responsible for casualty counts that reach into the millions. Jake nodded and began to provide context that would completely destroy the aliens' worldview. The commander who preceded me in the Third Corps had a career kill count of over 120,000. He was considered a moderate leader who avoided unnecessary casualties whenever possible. The Kethval representative, who had, i.e., been helped back to his position after his earlier collapse, made sounds that the translator couldn't convert into recognizable words. The concept that Jake's enormous numbers represented restraint and moderation was beyond their ability to process. During Earth's Second World War, individual generals were responsible for casualty counts in the hundreds of thousands, Jake continued. One particular operation planned by human commanders resulted in over 200,000 enemy deaths in a single campaign. Carter added historical context that made the situation even more incomprehensible to the peaceful aliens. That same war saw political leaders making decisions that led to millions of military and civilian casualties. The human leader who ordered the use of nuclear weapons to end the conflict was directly responsible for over 200,000 immediate deaths. The chamber erupted in sounds of distress so profound that medical teams from multiple species rushed to assist delegates who were experiencing complete psychological collapse. The Zephyrian ambassador's crystalline structure was now so fractured that he looked like a broken chandelier barely holding together. 200,000 from a single decision, he managed to ask through his damaged form, and that decision prevented an invasion that would have resulted in over 1 million casualties on both sides, Jake explained. Human leaders sometimes face choices where millions will die regardless of what they decide. The only question is how to minimize the total death count. Jake continued with examples that pushed the aliens beyond their breaking point. He described military leaders throughout human history who had commanded armies numbering in the millions, and whose strategic decisions affected entire continents. He explained how some individuals bore responsibility for casualty counts that reached into the tens of millions. The highest confirmed kill count for any individual human leader is approximately 50 million deaths, Carter stated matter-of-factly. That leader's decisions during a global conflict resulted in casualties on a scale that affected multiple nations and hundreds of millions of civilians. The few aliens still capable of conscious thought stared at the humans in absolute terror. The idea that a single being could be responsible for 50 million deaths was so far beyond their understanding that several species began making sounds that suggested complete mental breakdown. But Jake had one more revelation that would shatter their minds completely. The important thing you need to understand is that I'm considered one of the good ones, he said quietly. Everything I told you about carrying the weight of my decisions, about the sleepless nights and the faces in my dreams, about following rules of engagement to minimize casualties, that's what separates me from the humans with much higher kill counts. He paused, letting this sink in before delivering the final blow. There are humans whose kill counts reach into the millions who sleep just fine at night. Leaders who ordered the deaths of entire populations without losing a moment's rest. Individuals who planned genocide and mass murder as casually as you might plan a meal. The chamber fell into absolute silence except for the sounds of alien minds breaking under the weight of these revelations. The concept that humans could not only kill on such massive scales, but do so without psychological burden, was the final piece that destroyed their understanding of intelligent life. Ambassador Carter stepped forward to deliver humanity's final message to the Galactic Council. We come before you requesting membership in your peaceful alliance. Our commitment to peace is absolute, but it's a commitment backed by our understanding of war better than any species in the known galaxy. She gestured to Jake, who stood calmly despite having just revealed casualty numbers that had psychologically destroyed dozens of alien delegates. Humans choose peace not because we're incapable of war, but because we're too good at it. We've learned through bitter experience that violence only leads to more violence unless it's applied with overwhelming force to achieve lasting peace. Carter continued with humanity's proposition to the Galactic Council. We offer our membership not as another peaceful species that has evolved beyond conflict, but as the one species that can guarantee your peace will be protected. We are the violence you will never have to commit, the warriors you will never have to become. The Zephyrian ambassador's shattered form somehow managed one final question. You terrify us beyond our ability to express. Your species represents everything we have evolved beyond. How can we possibly accept beings like you into our alliance? Jake Morrison answered with quiet certainty. Because sometimes the galaxy needs monsters to keep the peace. You've built something beautiful here, something worth protecting. But what happens when you encounter a species that hasn't evolved beyond violence? What happens when peaceful beings like yourselves face enemies, who see your pacifism as weakness? He looked around the chamber at aliens who had lived their entire civilizations without ever facing real threats. We're offering to be the shield between your peace and the darkness that exists in parts of the galaxy you've never had to see. You don't have to become like us. You just have to let us stand between you and anything that would destroy what you've built. Ambassador Carter concluded humanity's presentation. Our application for membership comes with a promise. We will follow your laws, respect your customs, and contribute to your peaceful civilization. But if the day ever comes when your peace is threatened by forces that understand only violence, humanity will step forward to face that darkness so you never have to. The chamber remained silent as the alien delegates struggled to process humanity's offer. They had encountered a species that terrified them beyond their ability to comprehend, yet that same species was offering to use their frightening capabilities to protect rather than destroy. The Keth Val representative, speaking through obvious psychological trauma, managed to voice what many were thinking. Your species terrifies us more than anything we have ever encountered. But perhaps that is exactly why the galaxy needs you. The greatest predators in known space had just asked to become the guardians of peace, and the civilized galaxy would never be the same again.